Well, good morning, LinkedIn. My name is Joel Bennett, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of Practical Leadership, an opportunity for you to learn more about how to be an effective leader and build leadership habits into your daily work. If you are tuning in live today, please do me a favor and say hello in the comments and share where you're joining in from. It's a lot more fun when I actually know that somebody's out there. So go ahead and jump into the comments and share. If you were with us last week, for our session with Mark Bloodworth on passion-driven leadership, please share what you've been practicing since that session and what you're doing to improve your own leadership. And if you'd like, with that, share any successes you're having or any challenges you're running into along the way. So let's see who's joining us today. We'll see what's rolling into the comments. Looks like Nerdon is joining us. Fantastic. Kathy, great to see you. Megan, good to see you as well. Emma, we're getting a little bit better representation from folks in the U.S. over Canada this time around. That's great. Alyssa, David, great to see you. And Drex, thanks for joining us. It's a new name for us, so I'm glad that we're expanding a little bit in our reach. As far as today goes, our sessions, Practical Leadership, is really about tackling real leadership issues and challenges that you are having. And so what we want to do is share a little bit, encourage you to apply what you're learning, and then provide real actionable steps in how to put that into practice with your own leadership and as well as the team culture you're trying to create. I've asked leadership experts from around the world to kind of share their own perspectives or experience that they've had on these topics. And today I'm excited to be joined by Chris Taylor, CEO of Actionable in Toronto, Canada. Through Actionable, Chris has had the opportunity to help over 2,000 organizations ensure a positive ROI on their training investments. Thanks for joining me, Chris.
Thanks for having me. This is a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to see you again. So our topic today is on driving impact through habits. And in some ways, this is a little bit of a callback to the first episode, really on building leadership habits. But Chris has built his whole business around this topic, and I think you'll be interested to hear his perspective. And I'm excited to get his thoughts here in just a minute. But before we get started, I want to reinforce again that I'd love for you to be active in the comments as we go. Please share your perspectives, ask questions, or kind of wonderings that you have along the way. And if you're watching this as a recording, you're not off the hook. I'd ask that you utilize the comments as well, just to give us feedback and any questions that you may have, and I'll answer them as soon as I get to them. I'm going to check again who's here. Anybody else we're missing? Jay Colbert, good to see you. Kevin, you're going to see great product placement today, whether you realize it or not. And Ruby, thanks for joining us as well. So it looks like we've got a pretty good group of folks here, kind of a full house. So let's get started, Chris. And hopefully some of the other viewers know that we do a lot of partnership with organizations to really try to develop their people in ways that reach far beyond the classroom. And in discussions that you and I have had, I've often heard you say that it's not about the content, which I think would be interesting to a lot of people when we talk about things like training and development. So can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's funny because it's gained a lot of momentum and a sort of a life of its own, this idea that the training is not about the content. But it started as a bit of a running joke between me and some colleagues who produce truly exceptional content. And so it was a bit of a provocative statement. But here's the thing, and those that produce great content, yourself included, Joel, if we really sort of think about it, most folks would agree that the content itself does not create change, does not create impact. I mean, all of us have been on the receiving end of really thought-provoking content. We go to a conference or we're in a training session and we're like, wow, I had never thought about the world that way. The classic paradigm shift. Paradigm may have shifted, but then when we go back to work, nothing may have changed unless we actually do something with it. And so for me, it became about this sort of mantra of it's not about the content, it's about what you do with the content and how you actually put that into practice. So there's your frame for it, Joel.
Okay. Well, and obviously this is something that you and I work with a lot. And I think a lot of people can relate to this kind of this phenomenon of whether they go to training at work, they go to a conference, maybe they see a great TED talk or something else where they get really motivated, get really excited about it. They feel like they understand things a bit better than they did before.
Sure.
And then a day later, 3 days later, a week later, they don't even remember what they heard.
Yeah.
Remember, maybe it was fun or it was exciting, but a part of the process really is about putting this into practice and
Yeah.
reflecting on how it's going. One of the reasons why we've set up practical leadership the way we have is to get people to move beyond just the topic and actually put it into practice. So as you think about this, people might be listening to us and say, well, that's a great theory,
Sure.
and yeah, maybe that makes sense to me, but a lot of leaders go into this realizing that a big part of their role is leading change.
Right.
So how do they kind of balance that? How do they do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and so this is where the rubber hits the road, because there's two issues at play here around translating content into action and ideally into lasting change, right? Um, Number one is what you alluded to, which is, and most people have seen the stat or heard it around, a week later, we retain 4%, 10%, 12% of what we learned. And that's a very real phenomenon. It's based on, or it's being sort of documented through something called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And it acknowledges that even an hour later, 24 hours later, how much we forget from what we learned. And so that's just a fact. There are ways that we can improve retention. And that, there's some great tactics out there, drip feeding content, engaging in reminders of the content over time. And all of that is good. But to me, it misses the point, because if we've retained information but haven't applied it, we're pretty much the same as we were before we had that information as a starting point. So piece one is retention, but piece two, to your point, is around enacting change. And what we see far too often in corporate environments is individuals, employees being exposed to information, first of all, a lot of it, and then expecting that they will remember all of it, which we know isn't going to happen, full stop. But secondly, that they will then take action on it. And that's a fair request. That's a great goal, is that employees hear information and then take action on it. But what's going on between consuming the new information where it hits me at a cerebral level and putting it into practice is a whole lot of steps that we don't necessarily take account for. There's the act of, first of all, and really this is a critical component, do I care about this information, right? Because just because I heard it and I understand it doesn't mean that I actually care. And why does it matter if we care? Well, because I would say to a person, particularly in, well, really anyone watching this session, we are saturated with work, right? There's no one that I've come across in the last 10 years that's walking around going, I got all this extra time. What am I going to do with this time, right? Every person we talk to is time starved, dropping things off their plate, particularly in the last couple of years, feeling the effects of burnout and just worn downness, right? That doesn't prime us well towards engaging in new behaviors, right? And putting new ideas into practice. If we're in sort of survival mode and I just need to get through the things I need to get through, our willingness to explore new things, and by definition, with new things, be uncomfortable with them, be less than, skilled at them at first, our willingness to do that is just very, very low. And so the only way that we as leaders can break through that for our employees is one of two directions. It's carrot or stick, right? The stick is, well, you have to do this, otherwise your job is at risk, which can work to a point, but we're going to park that over there. The carrot, the desire to change, needs to come from within for the individual, right? There needs to be that intrinsic motivation, as it's referred to want to change. And the only way that we get to that point of wanting to change based on new information is if we have contextualized that information for ourselves. In other words, we found the relevance. We found the so what for me personally in that content. So I actually have just a quick visual to show how this works. We as leaders, when we're thinking about what to share with our employee group, whether it's formalized training, whether it's sharing strategic plans, whether it's setting targets, there's some insight that shaped what it is that we're working towards. And then we're giving them content. In many cases, too much content. We'll come back to that in a sec. If we expect them to go from content at the top straight down to action, we're missing that contextualization phase. So it is critically important that we are taking into account the fact that people need time and space and in most cases dialogue, to actually work from the I get it to I care about this to want to change. So one of the things that we can do as leaders out of the gate, and what you can absolutely amplify the number of people who are taking your message to heart and putting it into practice, is to reduce the amount of content that you're sharing with them, i.e. net new ideas. And for each net new idea, allowing the time and space for people to internalize and find the so what for me. What we have found is that one of the most consistently effective ways to help people find the so what is, even introvert, extrovert, doesn't matter, to give them time to talk about it with their peers, to actually turn it over. The extroverts will gain clarity through speaking, right? As you know, some of us, myself included, tend to think through our mouths. As we're articulating, what it is or why it matters, we'll start to come to the realization of why it matters. Introverts will pick up on the different perspectives of the other people in the team and be able to synthesize for themselves which pieces really resonate with them or not. So regardless of where someone falls on the sort of how you process information spectrum, dialogue gives people the time and space to actually find relevance in the content to then want to take action on it.
So it's interesting that when you talk about time to reflect, I think one of the frustrations at times for me when I work with organizations who invite me in to help with leadership training, or developing leaders, especially in what I do, frontline leaders, folks that have typically never done this before or very new at it. There is this this thought that the more I can throw at them fast,
Yeah,
the more they'll pick up, right? And so years ago, I stopped doing things like, full days of training. Hey, can you come in for a day and go through 4 or 5 topics and really just crank it out so we can get these guys through it.
yep.
And there's nothing wrong with that, maybe in other settings, but in the setting that I typically work in, and I think leadership in general, if you don't actually have an opportunity, to your point, to contextualize it, like, yes, I understand this in theory.
Yep.
Now, what does this look like for me? What does this look like for my team? Where am I good at it? Where am I not good at it? And then actually practice it, have
Yep.
that time to practice it. Again, I think a lot of it's lost. And too often with the folks that I work with in the blue collar industry, they'll say like, yeah, those are a lot of good words, but you're not explaining to me how I'm going to do this.
Right.
And so it's that context building in our sessions and then the time to practice in between. And for us, that could be a week, that could be a month, but to really give them an opportunity to try it and then to be able to reflect in some ways on how it's going.
Yep.
Because to your point, sometimes the best learning that we can do is by being bad at it for a while, right? Making mistakes and learning from them, reflecting on what we're doing.
Yeah.
So as you think about this process, how could leaders, and I'll use new leaders, but it could really be any leaders, kind of build in this rhythm of practice and reflection into their daily work or into their daily practice of these new ideas?
Yeah, beautiful. And so I want to talk about it from a leader perspective, but I want to go back to a really important point that you mentioned in there, which is, as an external provider of training, you're contracting with clients and the clients are buying training from you. And you have a sense of what that means and they have a sense of what that means. But I find it's really interesting, exactly to your point, to dig into what are they actually wanting to buy? Because the statement or the push from clients, and if you're someone listening to this who purchases external training, I'd encourage you to think about this. What is it that you're actually buying? Are you buying content? In which case, the positioning is very much how much content can I get jammed into as little time as possible, because that costs real money, and for as little dollars as possible. So it becomes a content purchase that you're going through there. The other alternative is you're buying outcomes. You're buying shifts in the culture, in the people that are a part of that training. And in that case, the opportunity with your provider is to dig into what does the world look like, our world look like on the other side of this training successfully deployed? How are people acting differently, thinking differently, speaking differently, interacting differently? And once we've identified that, then it becomes about the fastest, most efficient path to those outcomes, not to more content. we've been through this exercise. You mentioned earlier, Actionable is being used in 2,000 programs. I think we're closer to 2,500 now. We've been through this thousands of times, and it's fascinating to watch the almost palpable relief that kicks in for the buyer when they shift from, I'm trying to jam content in here, knowing, because I've been doing this for 3+ years, 20 years, that it doesn't work to try to jam more content into less time. But if I shift to the outcomes that I want, suddenly it's way less content that I need in order to do that. It's way more context. The participants enjoy it more because they feel the actual movement for themselves. The client benefits, and the facilitator gets to do what they do, which is not deliver training, but to drive change. And I think it's just such an important reframe, starting from asking the question, yes, you want to buy training, but what is it you're actually buying? Content or outcomes? I'll put that over there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I think that can be, well, for many organizations, that's a big paradigm shift, right?
Yeah.
And I don't mean this in a pejorative way at all, but sometimes when I have those conversations, companies they don't have a clear idea of what they want to get accomplished or what they want to change. They just want better, right?
Yeah.
So today I've got inexperienced leaders who kind of struggle to manage people. I get a lot of complaints in HR or whatever else. I just don't want to have that anymore. Well, for us to actually get down to brass tacks and say, okay, but what would change that? What do you want to see them do differently that would put us in a different place, a week from now, a month from now, a year from now? And most often it's not about learning more, right? Content is important, and we actually have a question in the comments about how important is content. I think Kathy asked what percentage of content is important.
Yep.
And you said earlier, and I want to reinforce, I mean, you got to have good content.
Absolutely.
Right? You can't have crappy content and then try to build context off of crappy context that doesn't work.
Right.
And then ask people to practice stuff that doesn't work. That obviously doesn't make sense. But for me, we started doing a lot of this training differently in 2017. And we said, going from then on, hey, our sessions are going to be 2 hours long.
Nice.
And we're going to really just have, 2 or 3 main points, kind of practice items that we want to talk about in the session. Sure, Joel's going to facilitate some of that, but a lot of it's going to be small group and large group discussion. And we're building that context in the session so that we can create an action plan, right? That we can actually come up with what I'm going to practice. If I miss the back half of that, the front half of it, no matter how good it is, it just doesn't matter.
Yeah, you absolutely need both parts, right?
I love the way that, as you've worked with organizations, as you and I have worked over the years, I love how we're able to frame that on the front end of, okay, tell me exactly what behaviors do you want to see change?
Yep.
Let's build that into the content.
Yep.
Let's build that into that active reflection and practice so that in the end of this, you're not only seeing more of it, but you're seeing the impact that you want to see.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I think going back to your question about what can leaders do in that case, actually, sorry, I'll hit Kathy's question. This preliminary data, so for those who don't know, we sit on as far as I know, one of the world's largest leading data sets around behavior change in a corporate workplace. It's a fascinating sort of area to study, at least I think so. And one of the things that we are able to look at is the type of session structure that is driving behavior change. And so the short answer is between 1/3 to 1/5 of the time in session spent on net new concepts. That's the sweet spot. So the question of how much content is the right amount of content, it's going to vary, but 1/3 as the most to 1/5 at sort of the lower end seems to be where we're seeing the greatest impact, which means the 2/3 to 4/5 of the session are spent in contextualization, in individuals finding their own relevance. And Joel, you used the word facilitation, which I love, and I think gets misused in a lot of cases as well. Not to say you did, but facilitation for some people means delivering more content. That's not facilitation, right? Facilitation in the true sense is facilitating dialogue between different people. And so the role of the trainer, facilitator, in my view, is, again, if you use those ratios, not just my view, data-driven, is 1/3 to 1/5 of delivering compelling content in a way that people get, the mission being that they get it quickly and that it shifts their paradigm. Those are the two criteria. And then the rest of the time spent helping people find relevance, right? Finding their own so what.
Wow.
The question of I lost the question. What was the question? What can leaders do to what?
Well, and actually, let me back up as we're finishing up on this topic. If folks do have questions, feel free to keep dropping them in the comments. We've got enough time today that I think we can get to a few more if you have them, or if you have your own experience with this that you'd like to share, whether it's to reinforce our point or to challenge our point. We'd love that too. I think for me, Chris, that whole piece of creating that rhythm, right? So we talk about it in a session, but if I'm just an individual leader, I'm sitting on this call, I'm like, oh, okay, that's interesting. How would I actually practice this or build this kind of this reflection routine into my daily work?
Yeah, love it. So I'm going to answer that in two parts. The first thing, in a very practical sense, that you can do is look at an upcoming meeting agenda that you have, and actually just go through it, right? And say, through the lens of how much of this is content, as in net new information for the people in the room or meeting, and how much of this is space, breathing time for them to contextualize and find relevance in it. You will maybe not be surprised, but in most cases we see when you do this audit, you've got like 95% content and you are aggressively pushing the edges of the agenda, right? You're gonna have like a minute at the end for takeaways, maybe, in a lot of cases, and that ratio just really needs to flip. But here's I lost my screen. One sec. There we go. Just coming back to this model. If you design an agenda through the lens of what do I want to have happen at the end of this? How do I want people acting differently? That will inform your content. Here's the key pieces that I need to hit. You'll build in space and time for contextualization, and you will find that people will leave the room inspired. It's sort of that New Year's Eve moment, right? Of I learned some new stuff. I'm excited. I'm committed. It all makes sense to me. It's crystal clear. I'm going to leave and I'm going to get immediately hammered with all the to-dos and tasks that will derail me from achieving those objectives. This is why the focus on action, and we can get into this as much as you want, Joel, but the structuring what people are going to do in a very concrete, tangible, very bite-sized format matters. We want to make it easier for people to win than to fail in putting ideas into practice. But as a leader, the most important thing you can do, you can help them with that. But then the insight piece, this is not linear. This is circular, right? The insight is around reconnecting with that group and being deliberate around what happened since. This sounds probably pretty obvious, right? To have that check-in as to how's it been going. And yet I find it gets maybe a passing question. It's not nearly as structured as it could be. It doesn't need to be time intensive, doesn't need to be labor intensive, but it deserves an appropriate amount of space for people to come back together after they have road tested, battle tested the thing that they said they were going to do, not to do a pass fail, right? You did it or you didn't, right? Here's your reward or your punishment, but rather to say, what have we learned from this? And as we go into the next round, how are we leveled up because of it, right? Whether we established, it's a bit meta, but whether we established a pattern of behavior, a habit around that tactical thing that we committed to, we have absolutely developed a pattern of behavior, a habit around going through this cycle when we are exposed to new information as individuals. We've got clients that have been working with Actionable for 4+ years, that this is part of their operating rhythm. They are very and it's just embedded in their culture. Every leader, when they're trying to communicate new information to their team, every executive trying to cascade things down, they have conditioned themselves to what are the outcomes we're trying to create? What's the minimum level of content required? How do I create the environment where people can find their own time and space? And then how do we help them take action on that in a way that's supported by their environment?
I want to come back to something you said earlier, because I think it bears repeating. There's a piece there about content, and this is maybe I don't have this quantifiably. I don't have research on this like you do, but quite often when I think about the content that we deliver, and again, I feel like our content is great, but for most people that walk out of there, they would say there's a Pareto principle kind of in play, right? That 20% of even the content we shared is going to drive 80% of the practice or the application or the change in that process. And so I'll have, some folks in our 2-hour sessions where typically we're providing maybe 45 minutes of new content for them to think about, with obviously practice and reflection as part of that session. But they may look at that 45 minutes and say, actually, there was this one thing that you said
Yep.
that clicked for me.
Yep.
Right. And now I can see what that means for me and my leadership and for my team. And now here's what I'm going to do differently as a part of that. So even though I can, the whole piece of, I think you said a third to a fifth of the session itself would be content. I would even say that, some of that content, maybe even minutes of that content are what's going to drive it for each person, because it is individual. The other piece I'll say with that is one of the changes that we made, roughly 2017, 2018, is that we start all of our sessions. So if we have a session on January 1st and we come back on January 8th, one of the first things we do is really ask the question of, okay, I want you to get into groups. I want you to share what have you been practicing since last time? How has it gone? What have you learned? What's still a challenge for you? Not only just to get people to talk about what they're doing, but to kind of be encouraged by the fact that they are making progress, even if that progress seems small.
Yep.
So that over the course of 30 days, they start to see that progress stacking.
Yep.
And so I'm going to go back to that practice and reflection through the context they build from the original content.
Yeah.
It sometimes for some people, it takes 5 minutes for them to kind of get into gear. For others, it may take that whole 30 days to recognize, like, oh yeah, this could work for me if I try it or I do it more often.
Yeah.
So I'm checking really quick on questions. Yeah, Kathy, I think, go ahead, Chris.
No, so yeah, while you're doing that, it's, you and I have been working together for a while. And as we've gone through this process, you mentioned Pareto principle. You've already, in my opinion, from the outside, done the work of stripping out the 80% to get focused on the 20% that's informing your high value sessions. To your point, there's another 80-20 within that. I don't know how many layers you can go on that, but I haven't seen anyone who's like truly got it down all the way, right, to a place of like, this is the thing. And that's why that feedback loop is so important too. The reason I use that model all the time, that the insight action flywheel, is that it works on all different levels. It's for the individual, it's for the team, but also for the organization. Like if you know that you're doing a leadership development program because you've got high turnover and you're trying to develop leaders that are retention magnets for your employee base, right? Being able to see the specific behaviors that the people that have the greatest improvement in employee retention are working on, right? What are the behaviors that they worked on? You can then separate everything else, and you could revisit that little piece of content in subsequent cycles, right? So you can get tighter and tighter and tighter on the content that is going to have the greatest impact. The way I tend to think about this is, if we were in the Matrix and you could just plug in and learn the things that need to be learned, right? I know Kung Fu. Most people would choose that over actual sort of time-based learning sessions, right? Again, from an executive buyer standpoint, because we want the outcomes, not just the experience. So, yeah.
Well, I know we're closing in our time here, Chris. In a couple of sentences, I'll give you up to a paragraph. If somebody is watching us today, and let's just do it from an individual leader perspective, maybe not somebody that's buying training on a corporate level, but from an individual leader, what do you feel like over the next 7 days? What could they practice? How could they put this into meaningful practice over the next week and get some traction on this? What's a simple thing that you would recommend for them?
Less is more. So I would, for a meeting agenda, for your own priorities for the day, if you could skinny it back to, what's the one thing you need to learn, need to do in the meeting? What's the one thing you need to communicate? And you go, well, that's not possible. I've got 15 things I need to communicate. It's like, okay, but then you're just passing the buck to your employees to figure out what's most important in there, right? So you can always add in with free space. That's a glorious thing about free space, is you can add in. But if you do the work up front of saying, here's the thing that I need shifted, or the thing I need communicated, and I need them to get the value, the importance of this, you will transform your meetings and the actions coming out of it. So I would start with that. Try to boil it back to the one thing, whether it's the one outcome or the one piece of content, and then incrementally add from there.
Well, I'd love to piggyback on your idea. And actually, I'm going to piggyback with somebody else's idea. Kathy K in the comments has said, I always end my session with what's the most important thing you're taking away from this. I think by skinning back your content and even a meeting, but ending the meeting with that, right? Okay, so based on everything we've talked about in the last 45 minutes or an hour of this meeting, what's your biggest takeaway, right? Or what do you feel like, what are you going to do next, right? And just inviting people into that to build that context, even in the midst of maybe a boring meeting. So with that, guys, LinkedIn can be used in a lot of different ways. Many of us use it as our social media platform, ways to have conversations or make connections. But today, I'd like you to use it as a bit of a catalyst for action. And for some of you, truthfully, accountability. Maybe you've tried this before. You haven't been able to stick with it. We're in the midst. I think today is, I don't know if the 18th, I've heard the 16th, I've heard the 21st. This is the days that most resolutions die from New Year's resolutions, because we've already given up on them, because we haven't been able to create the context and practice effectively. So you've already invested the time today to learn more about effective leadership, and specifically in today's session, how to drive impact through habits. But as Chris mentioned earlier, if you take that investment and do nothing with it, you've wasted that time. And so with that in mind, I do want you to identify your one thing. What's your one thing that you commit to doing over the next 14 days to take your leadership to the next level? And what I want you to do, once you have that, I want you to drop it into the comments. Again, just one single thing, so that when we get together on February 1st for our next session, that you can share how things went. And whether that's you had success or you've had challenges, maybe you come back and you need a little bit of a shot in the arm or a kick in the butt. But either way, that reflection is going to help. So go ahead and take 15 seconds now, drop in the comments. What's the one thing that you're going to take away from this session and start to put into practice even as soon as today? And while you do that, I want to thank Chris for joining me today. It's always fun for me to geek out on building habits and brain science, and obviously to encourage companies to adopt this methodology or think differently about the way they develop people. So thank you for being here, Chris.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure, Joel.
And so if you do want to get a hold of Chris, hear more about his work, I'd encourage you to reach out to him on LinkedIn or visit his website at actionable.co. And so that brings us to next week's, well, I say next week's session. Actually, I'm taking the week off next week. I'm going to go someplace south of here with blue oceans and really soft sand. But in 2 weeks, on February 1st, I'm excited to announce that executive coach and accomplished speaker Sean Shepard will be joining us from Toronto, Canada. And for those of you that have already sent me messages, yes, I will have guests from someplace other than Canada. I'm just letting our Americans warm up to the idea right now, but we do have Americans on the slate, as well as a few folks on the other side of the Pacific. So what Chris is going to be Sean is going to be tackling is really the thought process of how to become a peak performer. And so whether that's as an individual contributor, but more important for our context, a leader, what does peak performance look like, and what are the behaviors that get us there? So keep your eyes on LinkedIn for that posting, or if you'd like, drop a note in the chat, and I will make sure you get a personal invite. And so again, I encourage you to take action on something that you heard today, put it into practice as soon as today, so that you can be the leader your team needs. And if you found this useful, I hope you'll be back on February 1st. And if you're willing, share the session with a friend who you think might be able to get value out of it. If you've stumbled upon this session and we aren't connected on LinkedIn, shoot me a note, mention you've seen the session with Chris today, and we'll remedy that. But regardless, I thank you again for joining us and spending the time, and I hope to see you next time. Blessings.
Thanks, Joel.